Imagine this. You're living in the 14th century. Life is already terrible. Fleas, famine, and feudalism. But there's one more thing working against you, your left hand. That's right. Using your sinister side could get you burned, banished, or just eternally side-eyed by everyone from your priest to your pig-farming neighbor. Because in the Middle Ages being left-handed wasn't quirky. It was practically witchcraft. Literally. So if you were born a southpaw, congratulations, you were already halfway to heresy. And that's just the beginning of the absurd things people were punished for. Welcome to history's most ridiculous hit list. If you've ever felt weird for writing funny or breathing wrong, hit that subscribe button. This is the place where bizarre history finally gets the bedtime story it deserves. Lefties included. Imagine being born and immediately getting side-eyed by your entire village. Not because you cried funny or had a weird mole, but because you grabbed your first wooden rattle with your left hand. In the Middle Ages, this wasn't just an adorable baby quirk, it was a red flag, a spiritual an early warning sign that you might at some point in your toddling little life become a vessel for Satan himself, and you thought your parents were dramatic. The word sinister literally means left in Latin. And yes, that same word now gets used for serial killers, haunted dolls, and exes with revenge playlists. The linguistic shift wasn't an accident. It was a deliberate branding campaign by the medieval mindset, which had a habit of labeling anything even slightly off-center as morally contaminated. And by off-center we mean anatomically left of the fork. If you were left-handed in medieval Europe, congratulations. Society believed your dominant hand was in a long-term relationship with the devil. Not metaphorically, not symbolically. They genuinely thought your hand had a working partnership with evil, somewhere between signing a treaty and exchanging friendship bracelets. And so, if you dared to write, eat, or God forbid, bless yourself with your left hand, you could find yourself lumped in with criminals, heretics, and that one guy in the village who talks to goats. Now, why all this fuss over a hand? Well, medieval Europe was a place where nuance went to die. People wanted binaries, good and evil, heaven and hell, right and, well, not right. And since the right hand was mentioned positively in the Bible, seated at the right hand of the Father, etc., the left hand became a kind of theological garbage chute. Let's add some fuel to the already blazing dumpster fire. Medical experts of the time, and I use that term very loosely, claimed that left-handedness was a form of physical imbalance, the result of a mother's sinful cravings during pregnancy, or a misalignment of humors. You know, the usual rigorous peer-reviewed scholarship of someone in a robe said it once. Church leaders followed suit. Bishops warned of the corrupt body language of the left-handed. Monks copied illuminated manuscripts while deliberately correcting the errors of left-handed scribes. If there were any left-handed scribes, that is. Most of them were force-converted via the sharp edge of a ruler, and some very enthusiastic yelling. Society didn't just dislike the left hand, it feared it. Superstitions ran deep. Crows landing on your left side, omen of death itching on your left palm, financial ruin, spilling salt with your left hand, straight to hell, no passing go, no collecting 200 pence. Now imagine you're a peasant in a mud-streaked tunic, trying to survive drought, plague, and whatever tax your lord made up that week. And on top of that, you have to remember to use the correct hand to feed yourself, or risk divine punishment. The stress alone could give you an ulcer. Not that anyone knew what an ulcer was. They'd just say your humors were staging a coup. So when did this left is evil thing start? Earlier than you'd think. Ancient cultures had their own beef with the left hand. In Mesopotamia and Egypt, the right hand was associated with strength and righteousness, while the left was suspicious. Even in early Roman law, omens coming from the left side were considered unlucky, though ironically Roman augurs faced south during readings, meaning their left was actually east. Directional hypocrisy, a proud tradition. But leave it to the Middle Ages to take a mild superstition and dial it up to 11. Because medieval Europe didn't just inherit fear, it industrialized it. They wrapped it in parchment, dipped it in wax, and whispered it during exorcisms. And you know what really sealed the deal? Language. Words are like historical tattoos, hard to remove, painfully etched in. Think about it. The right hand is not just directional, it's morally charged. You do the right thing, have a right to speak, right of way, right. Meanwhile, left becomes left out, left behind, or, in older slang, left-handed compliment, which is basically an insult dressed in awkward formal wear. Let that sink in. Even compliments were suspicious if they leaned to the left. So, how did this all play out in daily life? Well, for one, if you were ambidextrous, which was rare, you probably faked being right-handed, just to avoid social exorcism. Families forced children to switch hands. Schools, or whatever passed for schools, treated left-handedness like a behavioral problem. And worst of all, the community gossips had a field day. Are we seeing young Wulfric eating with his left hand again? Next thing you know, he'll be dancing on graves and speaking French. By the way, speaking French was another suspicious activity, depending on the year, but that's a different video. Now, just to be clear, this wasn't universal. Not every village had a dedicated lefty hunter, but the social disdain was widespread enough that most left-handed people were systematically erased from record. Their habits were hidden, their tools were modified, their stories went untold. Being left-handed wasn't just inconvenient, it was erasure by etiquette. So here's a thought experiment for the ages. If medieval society decided handedness was a spiritual crime, what other parts of your body would have gotten you accused? A birthmark? A limp? A habit of humming while thinking? In a world fueled by fear and folklore, your entire personality could land you in hot water, or boiling pitch, if we're being literal. Which means that being left-handed wasn't just a biological fact. It was a gamble, a risk factor, a mark that said, this one's different, watch closely, and they did. Because in a time when leprosy, famine, and Viking raids weren't quite terrifying enough, you had to make room for a new kind of horror, people who used the wrong hand to pick up a spoon. So yeah, breathe that in. Dust, plague, judgment and all. Welcome to the sinister side. If the Middle Ages had a corporate HR department, it would have been run by the church, except with more incense and significantly worse vacation policies. And if there was one thing that got the holy paperwork in a twist, it was the issue of left-handedness. Not because it impacted someone's ability to pray, or farm, or chant in Latin. No, because it looked suspicious. And in medieval theology, suspicious was code for possibly in league with Beelzebub. Let's set the scene. A monastery somewhere in 12th century England. Candle wax drips steadily onto a rough stone floor, chanting echoes through the nave. A boy, newly recruited to become a scribe or cleric, makes the unforgivable error of crossing himself with his left hand. Gasp. Scandal. Call the abbot. Better yet, call an exorcist. You see, in the church's intricate taxonomy of things we don't understand but must immediately condemn, the left hand fell squarely into the category marked malignant. The logic? God's chosen sat at his right hand. Jesus ascended to the right of the Father. The sheep, symbolizing the righteous, were sorted to the right side during Judgment Day. Meanwhile, the goats, the damned, obviously, were herded left, which meant that if your natural inclination was to favor the left hand, you were on metaphorically goatish footing. To be fair, the church wasn't entirely responsible for inventing the anti-left campaign, but they were absolutely its most dedicated marketing team. Left-handedness was treated not just as a physical oddity but as a moral blemish, a corruption of natural order, a heresy of the flesh, and nowhere was this more apparent than in religious ritual. Take communion, for instance. That moment when a priest offers the consecrated host, a literal piece of the body of Christ if you ask the theologians, to a kneeling parishioner. Everything had to be done with the right hand. Bread, blessings, benedictions, all strictly right-handed business. Using your left hand, that wasn't just unorthodox, it was borderline blasphemous. Even the act of genuflecting had rules. One knee, not two. Right side, not left. Lefties who tried to cross themselves mirror-style were quietly or not so quietly corrected, or worse, viewed as spiritually misaligned. And yes, that's an actual term used in a few monastic instructionals, spiritually misaligned. Because apparently the divine worked on a very strict axis system. Monasteries and convents, far from being safe havens of contemplation, were more like theological surveillance states. Every twitch of the wrist, every motion at the altar, was scrutinized for correctness. Left-handed monks were either retrained, read, punished, or kept away from ceremonial duties entirely. After all, why risk contaminating the Eucharist with your cursed hand? Let's take a quick detour into medieval iconography. Religious art, especially before the Renaissance decided anatomy was worth paying attention to, showed a very consistent pattern: the righteous on the right, the damned on the left. Archangels always fought with their right hand raised, devils lurked stage left. In Last Judgment scenes, you'll find souls being cast down to hell on Christ's left side. It wasn't even subtle. The message was practically printed in Gothic font: right ye good, left ye barbecue fuel. So, by the time someone in the 13th century started doodling with their left hand, the church had already spent centuries building a spiritual case against them. And let's be real, medieval clergy were not known for their chill. If you had a bodily habit that didn't conform, it wasn't quirky, it was a theological crisis. You were either possessed, cursed, or a cautionary tale in the making. Now imagine trying to become a priest under these circumstances. You're devout, you know your psalms, but every time you raise the chalice or trace the sign of the cross, your left hand takes the lead. What happens next? Well, you'd likely be sent to a mentor, someone assigned to correct you. That's a gentle way of saying you'd be subjected to a mix of verbal shame, painful correctional tactics. Ever tried writing Latin with the wrong hand while being smacked with a birch rod, and hours of prayer for deliverance? And if none of that worked, if your left hand just wouldn't cooperate with the right hand of God, you might find yourself quietly reassigned. Maybe to the kitchen, or the stables, or a solitary post copying texts no one would read. After all, better to be hidden than to scandalize the flock with your disobedient limb. Let's talk theology for a second, because that's where things get even weirder. The church believed in the idea of natural order, a kind of divine architecture for the universe. Every flower, every sunrise, every sheep had a purpose, and so did every body part. Deviating from that design was viewed as tampering with sacred blueprints, which is a poetic way of saying, if your left hand took the lead, you were somehow challenging God's entire plan. There's a certain irony to all this, of course. While priests were exercising southpaw tendencies out of young novices, they were also preaching about compassion, understanding, and the mysteries of divine creation. You know, that same divine creation that occasionally made someone favor their left hand. Apparently, even God had design flaws. It gets even more absurd when you realize that no one could actually explain why being left-handed was so dangerous. It just was. Like eating fish on a Friday or women reading books. The reasoning was circular. It's bad because we say it's bad, and we say it's bad because it's clearly bad. Case closed. And yet, this dogma wasn't just confined to isolated monasteries. It leaked into broader law, custom, and daily life. If the church disapproved of left-handedness, then schools, guilds, and even families followed suit, because who wants to raise a child who might accidentally summon demons during dinner? It's all tragically hilarious. The idea that one of the most powerful institutions in history spent hundreds of years freaking out over which hand someone used to hold a spoon. But that's the Middle Ages for you, a time when hygiene was optional, but moral panic was mandatory. Let's slow down for a second. Close your eyes. Imagine kneeling in a dim chapel, the scent of beeswax and old stone surrounding you. A priest extends his right hand to bless you. You, without thinking, mirror the gesture with your left. A gasp, a pause, a tremor in the air. That single movement, unconscious, harmless, might be the reason you never rise in the church, might be the reason you're labeled deviant, or worse. Let that sink in. Because for all its grandeur and incense, the medieval church had a very simple motto: conformity is godliness. And if your body didn't conform, neither did your soul. And so, being left-handed wasn't just a handy problem. It was a holy one. If you ever find yourself accused of a crime in medieval Europe, let's say heresy, or witchcraft, or just being vaguely annoying to a town official, you're going to want every advantage you can get. A good word from the local priest, a clean record, maybe an alibi involving sheep. But if you're left-handed, yeah, forget it. Might as well start practicing your last words. Left-handedness wasn't just considered weird back then. It was seen as a literal sign of guilt. Not the "we found blood on your tunic" kind of guilt. No, much more scientific. He stirred the stew counterclockwise with his left hand. So clearly, he communes with demons. Case closed. Hang him high. Let's talk about medieval justice. A term which, like medieval hygiene, or fun plague activities, is deeply misleading. Trials weren't exactly pinnacles of fairness. This was the era of ordeal by water, where drowning proved your innocence. Ordeal by fire, where getting burned was also proof of innocence. And the ever-popular trial by rumor, where the more people disliked you, the more likely you were guilty. Now toss left-handedness into that medieval blender of logic and superstition, and things got real spicy real fast. Picture it: a crowded wooden courtroom that smells faintly of wet wool and boiled onions. A woman stands accused of hexing the baker's son who, to be fair, did fall down a well after stealing his father's ale. But never mind that. The real problem. She churns butter with her left hand. Someone saw it. She's a witch. Q gasps, murmurs. Someone clutches their rosary so hard it leaves a dent. You see, the left hand had a kind of courtroom resume all on its own. It was shorthand for unnatural, for other. And in an age where being other often led to a very brisk walk to the gallows, it wasn't great press. And this wasn't just hearsay, real trial records, preserved in dusty archives, and definitely not written in crayon, mention left-handed gestures as suspicious behavior. One woman in 15th century France was accused of cursing her neighbor's livestock simply because she touched a cow's udder with her left hand in the middle of a field, with no actual witnesses to the curse, just the misfortune of being the village's resident oddball. It's absurd. But this was the logic. If the devil had to pick a hand, surely he'd go left. And so, if you did too, the math was obvious. Never mind that the devil was also blamed for crop failures, skin rashes, and unusually large hailstones. He was very busy, and apparently left-handed. Let's pause for a moment. Imagine being on trial. The crowd is restless. You're sweating under your wool cloak. The judge asks if you have anything to say in your defense. You instinctively gesture with your left hand. And just like that, you've sealed your fate. It's not just tragic, it's terrifyingly petty. Now, left-handedness wasn't the only thing that could get you condemned in court, but it helped a lot, especially when paired with other red flags, like being unmarried, outspoken, midwife adjacent, or, God forbid, literate. In some Germanic regions, trial customs even involved having the accused raise their right hand to swear innocence. If someone hesitated, perhaps out of confusion, nervousness, or say being naturally left-handed, it was seen as a sign of deception. Think about that. An involuntary twitch could literally cost you your life. Hope you weren't fidgety. And yes, in certain places, left-handedness alone wasn't enough to convict someone. But in the emotionally charged arena of a witch trial, where evidence included dreams, goats acting funny, and bad weather, being a lefty was like walking in with a flashing neon sign that read, "Definitely suspicious. Ask me about my toads." What's worse? You couldn't even defend yourself with logic. I write with my left hand wasn't a valid excuse. It was an admission. And trying to explain biology to a court that still believed headaches were caused by demons living in your skull. Not advisable. Take the infamous case of Agnès Lemoine, a French herbalist from the early 1400s. Locals claimed she could calm storms and talk to birds. Maybe she could, or maybe she was just a really good gardener with a lot of free time. But the real nail in her coffin, someone noticed she used her left hand to mix her herbal salves. She was arrested, tried, and burned. No one asked if she was ambidextrous. No one cared. Now, let's inject a bit of modern horror. Imagine a courtroom today, where you're accused of a crime, and your handedness is brought up as evidence. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, my client was seen signing her rent check with her left hand. What more do you need to know? Sounds ridiculous, right? And yet, this was someone's very real reality. Over and over. Even in legal documents, the word left appeared in damning phrases. Left-handed oath referred to an oath made falsely or in bad faith. Left-handed marriage meant a union without legal or religious recognition. Basically, the left was shady, unstable, and not to be trusted. And that bias infected everything from language to legislation. Which begs the question, what small thing about you, some harmless quirk or unconscious gesture would have marked you as a danger back then? Do you tap your foot when thinking? Do you talk to your cat like it's a roommate? Congratulations, you're now on trial for sorcery. So, what did left-handed defendants do? Sometimes they denied it. Sometimes they tried to switch hands, suddenly ambidextrous under threat of execution. And sometimes they ran. Left town, changed names, prayed no one would remember the time they peeled carrots the wrong way. And all of this happened in courts that claimed to be guided by faith, fairness, and reason. Let that irony marinate, because when justice depends more on superstition than on facts, when a hand gesture carries more weight than evidence, then no one's safe. Especially not the ones who reach out with the wrong hand. So next time you wave left-handed or high-five someone from the southpaw side, remember there was a time when that simple motion could have been your last, and the judge, he probably wasn't impartial. He probably just hated lefties. Imagine your first day of school in medieval Europe. You're clutching a crude wax tablet, nervously eyeing the fire with the unblinking stare and an unsettling fondness for birch rods. You sit on a wooden bench that somehow feels harder than stone, next to other wide-eyed children in itchy linen. The room smells of damp parchment and collective fear. You reach for your stylus, with your left hand. Mistake. Within seconds, the friar's brows arch like cathedral spires, and his voice drops to a pitch that signals both divine wrath and academic disappointment. The classroom falls silent. You've committed a grievous error. You've written with Satan's favorite hand. Welcome to medieval education, where learning was paired with lashings and where curiosity was tolerated, so long as it didn't come from the wrong limb. For children born left-handed, medieval school wasn't just a struggle, it was a full-contact theological correctional facility. The church ran most educational institutions, and its grip on orthodoxy extended all the way to which hand you were allowed to use for your letters. Writing with your left wasn't a charming eccentricity. It was a dangerous deviation, one that required immediate painful adjustment. Let's talk about tools. The average classroom weaponry included long wooden rulers, birch rods, open palms, and the occasional discipline strap, which sounds more like a medieval boy band, but was in fact a thick leather band used to whip knuckles into godly alignment. And if that sounds brutal for someone trying to write the alphabet, well, it was. Teachers, usually monks or priests, believed they were doing holy work by forcing children to abandon their sinister instincts. Every time a child picked up their stylus or quill with the left hand, it was not just a logistical inconvenience, it was a spiritual crisis. You weren't just wrong. You were a potential gateway for evil. And so, the correction process began. Step 1. Verbal shame. Do you want to be a servant of the devil, boy? Is that how Judas held his fork? Will you sign your pact with Lucifer next? These were not rhetorical questions. These were part of the official pedagogy. Step 2. Physical correction. Hands were struck, fingers tied together, left arms bound to the torso during writing exercises. Some students were even forced to sleep with their left hands immobilized, to encourage divine alignment in dreams. Because apparently God gave extra credit to those who conformed while unconscious. Step 3. Psychological warfare. Teachers warned students that using their left hand could bring about sickness, misfortune, and eternal damnation. One chronicled case from a monastic school in Bavaria tells of a child made to wear a red glove on his left hand, so everyone would know which part of him was marked. He was 7. All of this was done, of course, with the absolute conviction that it was for the child's own good. Instructors genuinely believed that the left hand was a pathway to corruption, a temptation to be stamped out before it took root. And what better place to crush temptation than in the fertile soil of childhood? But it wasn't just about writing. Left-handed children struggled with every part of the school day. Tools were made for right-handed use. Desks, writing boards, ink pots, all positioned to favor the righteous hand. If you leaned the other way, you smudged your ink. You blocked the light. You were literally working against the grain. Even physical posture was policed. Left-leaning stances during prayer or recitation drew scowls. Sword drills, for those lucky enough to attend nightly training schools, demanded right-handed technique. Lefties were told they'd never make a proper soldier, never write a clean script, never hold a proper Bible. So what did these children do? Some adapted, painfully, slowly, awkwardly. They forced their hands to relearn basic tasks, developing odd grips and lifelong tension injuries in the process. Others resisted quietly, in secret, continuing to draw, write, or eat with their left when no one was watching. And some broke under the pressure, internalizing the shame until it twisted their sense of self. Let that sink in. Your dominant hand, the one that made you feel coordinated and capable, was treated like a moral failing, not because of what you did, but because of who you were. and the effects didn't vanish with the diploma. Generations of forcibly corrected lefties carried that trauma into adulthood. Chronic hand pain, speech impediments, poor handwriting, low confidence. The legacy of classroom combat lived on in trembling signatures and hunched shoulders. Now here's the kicker. This wasn't just a medieval phenomenon. While the Inquisition faded, the educational crusade against left-handedness kept going. Victorian school teachers inherited the same prejudices, armed with their own upgraded arsenal of correctional tools. Even in the 20th century, students were punished for writing with their left hand. In the 1960s, in public schools, let that timeline haunt you. But back in the medieval classroom, there was little room for nuance. A child's instincts were dangerous. Their habits had to be sanctified. The left hand, unclean, unruly, had to be tamed before it turned into something worse. The classroom was a battlefield, and the war was against the body itself. There's a certain horror in that, not the blood and swords kind, but the quiet kind. The kind where a child reaches out in trust and is told that their very motion is sinful, that their natural expression must be suppressed, all in the name of faith, order, and a flawless handwriting style that only a right-hander could achieve. So next time you see an old medieval manuscript, pages of flawless calligraphy, illuminated letters, and painstaking marginalia, take a second to wonder, how many aching wrists went into that? How many smudges were beaten out of existence? And how many children were forced to erase part of themselves to make their writing correct? Because in the medieval classroom, the lessons were clear. Obedience is virtue, uniformity is holy, and your left hand is never to be trusted, not even with a pencil. If you thought being left-handed in a classroom was rough, wait until you try to get a job. In the medieval world, survival wasn't just about faith and superstition. It was also about labor, and labor meant crafts. And crafts meant guilds. And well, they didn't exactly roll out the red carpet for southpaws. Let's start with the basics. Imagine you're a young peasant named Tom. You've got decent teeth, a strong back, and dreams of becoming a blacksmith. You show up at the village forge, eager to apprentice under Master Edric, a man whose beard contains both wisdom and fragments of iron filings. You pick up a hammer with your left hand. The clang of metal halts. An apprentice drops his tongs. Master Edric squints at you like you just licked the anvil. Left-handed, are you? You nod. Proudly. A mistake. Because in the tightly regulated, tradition-drenched world of medieval guilds, being left-handed wasn't just unusual, it was suspicious, unlucky, impractical, and, in some cases, flat-out disqualifying. Guilds, think of them as ancient trade unions with a flair for robes and rigid hierarchies, controlled every major profession. Blacksmiths, carpenters, masons, weavers, shoemakers, all organized under specific guilds with their own rituals, rules, and deeply entrenched biases. And one of the things they didn't like, variance. If you couldn't fit the mold, you didn't make the mold. Left-handed apprentices faced a very literal problem. Tools. Everything, and I mean everything, was designed for right-handers. Hammers, knives, shears, looms, chisels, and even measuring instruments were built with the right-hand user in mind. There was no left-handed section at the local medieval Home Depot. If you were left-handed, you either adapted or failed. Now, adapting wasn't just inconvenient, it could be dangerous. Take woodworking, for instance. Using a plane or chisel backwards could ruin the grain. Worse, it could send shards of oak into your face. In glassblowing, a poorly held rod could mean molten disaster. And in smithing, misaligning a strike might not just cost you a product, it could cost you a finger. But did guildmasters care? Not really. Many saw left-handedness as a sign of sloppiness or spiritual misalignment. A young lefty was seen as unreliable, even cursed. Some guilds quietly refused to train them. Others corrected them early, before the habit became muscle memory, which, in this case, meant before your instincts got you labeled a liability. Let's talk tools again, because they're the unsung antagonists in this story. Ever try using scissors with your non-dominant hand? Now imagine they're 3 pounds heavier and sharpened by a man who believes demons live in fingernails. Medieval shears were brutal, and tailoring, a surprisingly complex art, demanded symmetry. You want a shirt that doesn't drape like a cursed potato sack? Better cut it clean. and better not use your left hand to do it. And yet, in spite of these challenges, some left-handed craftsmen thrived. Quietly, secretly. They learned to hide their instincts, to fake right-handedness during inspections, to reserve their true skills for moments of solitude. Imagine Tom, now older, now weathered, hammering away after hours with his left hand, crafting better horseshoes than any of his right-handed peers, but knowing he could never admit it. Then there were the stories. Every profession had its whispered tales of the odd craftsman, the one who worked late, who didn't speak much, whose work was flawless but whose hands moved differently. Sometimes these men were admired in secret. More often they were watched closely for signs. Of what, exactly? Witchcraft, possession, subversion. Because if your body worked differently, and your work turned out better, it couldn't be skill. It had to be unnatural. Let's not forget the social rituals either. Guilds weren't just about tools. They were about hierarchy and symbolism. New apprentices swore oaths, signed charters, even performed initiation tasks, all with the right hand. Using the left hand during such rituals could be seen as disrespectful or ominous. One misplaced gesture, and your career was over before it started. Now imagine this system applied across Europe. In every bustling town, every soot-streaked workshop, every tiny village where old men passed down secrets in gravelly whispers, the entire economic engine of the pre-modern world ran on handcrafted labor, and that labor had a built-in gatekeeping mechanism against left-handed people. So why didn't they just make left-handed tools? Because the idea that left-handedness was something to accommodate rather than correct would have seemed absurd, like making shoes for people with two left feet. Left-handedness wasn't seen as a difference, it was a defect, which leads us to one deeply medieval truth. Conformity was efficiency. Standardization made training easier. Assembly lines didn't exist yet, but uniformity still mattered. If every apprentice held the tool the same way, taught by the same master, doing the same motions, everything moved faster. Left-handers slowed the rhythm, disrupted the flow, introduced chaos. And chaos, in a world already teetering on the edge of famine, plague and surprise invasions, was intolerable. Let's return to Tom, our hypothetical lefty. Maybe he got lucky. Maybe he found a small shop that valued output over dogma. Maybe he became a cobbler, fixing shoes with quiet precision. But even there he'd face the same issues. Tools that fought him, customers who stared, superiors who sighed. His work might be flawless, but his method would always be suspect. And if a tool broke in his hand, if a fire started in the workshop, if a customer tripped outside the door, people would talk. Did you see how he holds the oar? Like a witch, or worse, like a foreigner. Because in the end, the curse of the left wasn't just about tools. It was about trust, about tradition, about fear dressed up in the language of craft. And so, the left-handed craftsman worked in silence, in shadow, in shame, carving wood, shaping leather, hammering metal. Always carefully, always quietly, always the wrong way. But also, the only way he knew. Picture this. You're a fresh-faced young knight in training in the 13th century. You've got dreams of glory, a horse that barely listens to you, and a sword that's just slightly too heavy. You line up for your first day of weapons practice, heart pounding, the air thick with the smell of sweat and boiled turnips. You draw your sword with your left hand, and the drill master stares at you like you've just farted in Latin. That's because in medieval warfare, being left-handed wasn't a tactical advantage. It was a liability, a dangerous deviation, a great way to get accidentally stabbed by your own side. Let's get into the gritty logistics of it. Medieval combat was choreographed chaos. Soldiers stood shoulder to shoulder, shields locked, spears leveled, all moving as one writhing wall of iron and adrenaline. And when you're trying not to die by enemy sword or friendly fire, formation matters. Everyone's movements are designed to complement the guy next to him, which works great, until someone throws off the rhythm by swinging from the opposite side. That's where left-handers ruined everything. Your sword arm's on the wrong side. Your shield angle leaves your neighbor exposed, and the entire line risks collapsing like a badly baked meat pie. And because medieval battles were won or lost by cohesion, not by heroic duels like in the movies, one oddball lefty could endanger an entire flank. So what did they do with these southpaw saboteurs? Simple. They trained it out of them. Just like in schools and churches, left-handedness was considered a problem to be corrected. Left-handed squires were forced to practice with their right hand from the beginning. Sword grips were swapped. Archery techniques were flipped. Shield straps were misaligned on purpose to encourage proper form. And if the lefty refused to change, if his body stubbornly clung to its original instincts, well then he was probably given a different assignment, maybe as a scout, or a cook, or some other less disruptive role. And if he was nobility with enough clout to demand a sword anyway, he'd still be treated with skepticism by fellow knights who believed uniformity was strength, because nothing says cohesion like forcing every single warrior to move in synchronized awkwardness. But here's the twist. Being left-handed actually could be an advantage. In duels, especially one-on-one, a lefty often confused their opponent, whose muscle memory was trained to anticipate right-handed attacks. Historical fencing manuals from the Renaissance even note special techniques for dealing with left-handers, which means there were enough of them around to cause concern. But in true medieval fashion, this advantage was treated with suspicion. If you won a duel and you were left-handed, people muttered that it wasn't skill, it was sorcery, trickery, possibly some pact with a dark entity who gave you freakishly fast reflexes in exchange for your immortal soul. You know, standard tournament gossip. Take the story of Ser Oswin of Durnmere, a minor knight from a forgotten border region, who reportedly defeated 5 opponents in a row during a regional tourney. His secret: he fought with his left hand. Spectators called it unholy and unnatural. He was later disqualified for dishonorable technique. What was dishonorable about it? He won too efficiently, and nobody understood how. That kind of paranoia wasn't just limited to the battlefield. Training schools and fencing guilds, particularly in Germany and Italy, sometimes excluded left-handed students, claiming they disrupted drills and slowed the class. Other schools let them in, but refused to adapt the curriculum, leaving lefties to struggle with reversed footwork, mirror image stances, and painful shoulder cramps. Very medieval of them. And let's not forget the weapons themselves. Swords and daggers were often crafted with specific hilts, guards and balance points meant for right-handed use. Shields were strapped to the left arm, not just for consistency but for strategic function. Your left side protected, your right side free to strike. A left-handed fighter had to reverse this entire setup. But armorers rarely, if ever, made left-handed gear. Why waste precious resources on someone clearly born broken? So you made do. You twisted straps, filed down grips, trained yourself to fight wrong, and then prayed you didn't die because your gauntlet pinched your wrist at the wrong moment. But of course, most of this only applied if you were allowed to fight at all. Because here's the darker truth. Many left-handed men simply weren't given the chance. If your handedness was discovered early, as a child during toy swordplay or training drills, you might have been quietly redirected toward a safer path: clerical work, scribing, farming, something with fewer sharp objects and lower chances of accidentally stabbing a comrade in the liver. All of this reveals a chilling pattern. In medieval Europe, it didn't matter if you were talented, it mattered if you fit the mold, if you could be trained, controlled, made identical. Left-handedness disrupted that illusion of order, and order was everything when your world could fall apart with a single swing of steel. Let's take a breath here. Picture a silent morning on a grassy field. The sky is heavy. A young knight tightens his gauntlet, his breath slow and focused. His sword rests in his left hand. Steady. Around him, others whisper, "Watch, judge," because this man does things differently, because he doesn't fit. And as he walks forward to meet his opponent, he knows his greatest threat isn't the blade in front of him, it's the system behind him. So yes, being left-handed in medieval warfare could win you a duel, but it could also get you killed, not by your enemy, but by your own comrade's fear. And that, in the end, was the deadliest weapon of all. If medieval Europe had a customer service policy for left-handed people, it would read something like "returns not accepted, re-education mandatory, and public shaming encouraged," because when the schools failed and the monasteries frowned, society rolled out its favorite form of behavioral correction: good old-fashioned humiliation. That's right, if your left hand dared to step out of line, literally, you could find yourself the star of your own morality play, with the entire village cast as your disapproving audience. Let's begin with the medieval marketplace. the bustling heart of any town. A public square filled with traders, gossip, livestock, and at least one man yelling about onions. Now imagine a child caught writing with their left hand, or a servant stirring stew the wrong way. What did the local authorities, or just the nearest self-righteous bystander do? Simple, make an example of them. In some towns, a child might be made to stand on a stool, arm outstretched, holding a weight in their left hand, a literal burden of their sin, while villagers walked by shaking their heads and muttering about curses. For adults, it could be worse. Public confessions, forced apologies, or even penitence parades, where the offender was marched through town holding a placard reading something like, "I used my left hand to steal God's favor." These weren't punishments in the traditional sense, they were performances. A chance for the community to remind itself what was normal, and to reinforce that anyone outside that line would be paraded back into it, preferably red-faced and shaking. And because this is medieval Europe we're talking about, where everything has to have at least one layer of religious overkill, public humiliation was often tied to penance. A left-handed baker caught kneading dough the wrong way might be ordered to repeat the Lord's Prayer 30 times, using only their right hand, of course, in front of the church doors. Extra points if someone from the clergy stood behind them correcting posture. Let's talk about left-handed eating. It might seem ridiculous now. What does it matter which hand delivers your gruel? But in the Middle Ages, table manners were deeply tied to morality. The right hand was for eating, the left, for everything else. And by everything else, we're talking medieval hygiene. No toilet paper, just hands. You do the math. Using your left hand at the dinner table was seen as disgusting at best and dangerous at worst. So if you were a guest, especially in a wealthier home, or during a feast, and you reached for a shared dish with your left hand, the reaction was swift. You'd be mocked, corrected, and depending on the host's mood, either scolded in front of everyone or quietly uninvited from future meals. Food, after all, was social currency, and no one wanted to eat with the devil's dinner date. Some towns even had laws about this. Unofficial, of course, but deeply enforced. Market stalls posted warnings. Inns had expectations. And if you were known as that left-handed guy, you might find yourself served last, seated farthest, or denied altogether. Not out of hygiene, mind you, but because superstition was the real spice on the menu. But what if you resisted? What if, like some rebellious soul with a deeply inconvenient sense of personal agency, you insisted on using your left hand? Enter the exorcists. Yes, exorcisms. Because why stop at public ridicule when you can accuse someone of being literally possessed? Some parish records, sparse but terrifying, mention cases where children were subjected to minor exorcism rites for persistent leftward tendencies. Picture it, a nervous priest in a dusty chapel, muttering Latin over a sobbing 8-year-old, while the child tries to explain that he just likes holding spoons in his left hand. Demons weren't always cast out in dramatic fashion. Sometimes they were whispered at, chanted at, and then blamed for everything from left-handedness to nightmares to a weird rash on someone's back. And that's the really insidious part. Public humiliation didn't stop with the moment itself. It lingered. It lived in rumor, in whispered prayers, in the uncomfortable silence when your name was mentioned, because being labeled different was dangerous, and being remembered for it, even worse. Imagine a woman named Ellen. She's a good spinner, one of the best in her town, but she uses her left hand to feed the flax. One afternoon, a rival accuses her of cursing a neighbor's baby. No proof, of course, just Ellen's unsettling leftward lean. She's brought before the village elder. They can't prove anything, so they don't punish her. Not officially. Instead, they force her to stand during Mass, alone, facing the altar, holding a spindle in her left hand as the priest delivers a sermon on obedience. It's not punishment, they say, just a reminder, just a correction, just enough shame to do the job. And it works. People stop hiring her. Children run when she passes. And one winter, when the bread is scarce and the livestock thin, Ellen vanishes. Or maybe she moves. Or maybe someone finds her scarf near the river and decides not to ask questions. Because that's the thing about public humiliation. It was therapy for the crowd, not for the person. It gave people a way to discharge their own fears, their own doubts, by watching someone else take the fall. The left-handed were convenient, visibly different, harmless, yet symbolically threatening. And so, like jesters without jokes, they became the punchline in a drama about conformity. Let's pause. Think about your quirks. Do you tap your foot when nervous? Chew pens? Blink too often when lying? Now imagine your entire town watching you do it. Not with amusement, but with dread. And then imagine they decide to fix you, in public, with witnesses. That's what passed for moral instruction in the medieval world. Not compassion. Not understanding. Just a collective performance of fear. And when fear performs, it always wants an audience. If you thought being a left-handed blacksmith was bad, just wait until you're a left-handed wife. Welcome to the domestic battlefield of the Middle Ages. A place where superstition met patriarchy, shook hands firmly with the right, and promptly accused the left of witchcraft. Let's start with the obvious. Marriage wasn't exactly a romantic affair in medieval Europe. It was a contract, a survival strategy, a livestock transaction with bonus emotional neglect. And if you happened to be a woman, the expectations were rigid. You were to be obedient, modest, pious, fertile, and preferably not a vessel for demonic forces, which, as we've already covered, your left hand clearly was. So, imagine you're a woman named Isabel. You've got strong hands, a quiet mind, and a knack for butter churning, but you stir with your left. It's not intentional, it's just easier, feels right, natural, until your new husband, fresh off a dowry negotiation and 2 pints of medieval ale, notices. He doesn't say anything the first time, or the second. But then his mother sees it, and suddenly it's a crisis. Whispers follow. She stirs widdershins. That's counterclockwise for those not fluent in suspicious churning techniques. Milk turns sour in her presence. Her bread doesn't rise quite right. Clearly she's meddling with nature, or worse, undermining the very sanctity of the hearth with her cursed, unrighteous limb. Because the hearth, the literal and symbolic heart of the home, wasn't just where food was made, it was where purity was maintained, where domestic order was supposed to reflect cosmic order. Right hand, order. Left hand, chaos. And no one wanted to come home to a bowl of demonic porridge. Let's talk about household chores. Women were expected to perform countless repetitive tasks: spinning, weaving, milking, cooking, candle making, all of which involved tools designed by and for right-handed users. Spindles, churns, even the curved handles on certain knives were subtly engineered to favor the dominant majority. If you were left-handed, you had 2 choices: struggle in silence, or attract suspicion by adapting your technique. But heaven forbid you did something better with your left hand. Say Isabel weaves faster than her neighbors, her threads are tighter, her dye more vibrant. That's not talent, surely. That's sorcery. Jealousy quickly curdles into fear. And fear, as we've learned, rarely stays polite. Now, toss pregnancy into the mix. Medieval medicine already operated on the assumption that everything that went wrong in a woman's body was her fault. Stillbirth? Her humors were imbalanced. Sickly child. She had lustful thoughts. Left-handed midwife. Burn her. So when a left-handed wife gave birth, people watched. If the child had a birthmark, a crooked toe, or, God forbid, was also left-handed, it confirmed what the village already knew. This woman's body defied the natural order, and the church, always ready to turn gender politics into theology, had plenty to say about disobedient women and their dangerous limbs. Even household blessings, rituals meant to protect the home from evil, had hand-specific gestures. If a woman crossed herself or sprinkled holy water using the left, it didn't purify the home. It cursed it. At least that's what people believed. A wife who failed to adhere to these standards risked not just social rejection, but spiritual exile. Let's return to Isabel. One winter, her husband falls ill. Nothing unusual. Probably just dampness, mouldy rye, or the general fact of being alive in the 14th century. But he doesn't recover. And by week 2, the whispers start again. She fed him with her left hand. She prepared his poultice alone. She refused to let the priest into the room until the 3rd bell. Soon, the sickness is no longer natural. It's a curse. And the source of that curse? Obvious. Isabel is summoned. She stands in the town square, hands bound, both of them, just to be safe. The local priest recites verses while her neighbors clutch talismans. Her only crime: stirring soup with the wrong hand and surviving long enough to be noticed. And here's the part that really burns. Isabel might not be punished legally, There might be no formal trial, no sentence, but socially, she's finished. Friends distance themselves. Her husband's family stops speaking to her. Her name is added to the quiet list of women never to be left alone with the children. She is, in every way that matters, exiled without leaving her village. Because left-handedness in the domestic sphere wasn't just a quirk, it was a character flaw, a moral defect. And when attached to a woman, already viewed as spiritually weaker, more temptable, more flesh than soul, it became a glowing red flag of otherness. Let's reflect for a moment. Imagine being judged, not for what you believe, or even what you do, but for how your body moves. For emotion as instinctive as reaching for a cup or brushing flour from your apron, every gesture becomes a test. Every movement, a potential threat. And the worst part? You don't get to explain. No one asks if you chose it. No one wants to hear that your right hand was injured, or that your left just works better. Because the truth doesn't matter. Only the symbol does. And your hand, unfortunately, symbolizes everything they fear. So Sebel stops stirring. She switches hands. Her food spoils. Her wrist aches. But no one whispers anymore. And that, apparently, is peace. If you think modern left-handers have it rough dragging their palms through freshly scribbled ink, try being one in a medieval scriptorium. Welcome to the slow-motion torture chamber that was manuscript production, where beauty was mandatory, ink was temperamental, and being left-handed was essentially performance art with a side of excommunication. Let's set the stage. You're in a chilly stone chamber, somewhere inside a Benedictine monastery. The room is dim, lit only by narrow slits in the wall, and a few exhausted candles. Around you, rows of scribes hunch over parchment, scratching out Latin prayers with feathered quills. There's no heating, no breaks, just centuries of tradition pressing down on your spine like a holy migraine. Now imagine trying to copy the Book of Psalms with your left hand. First problem. You're dragging your palm directly through wet ink because the Latin script ran from left to right. And left-handers, bless them, followed it like everyone else, except they had to reach across their own writing to get there. The result? Smudges, streaks, inky chaos, God's word, now with extra blur. Of course, smudging wasn't just a cosmetic issue. These weren't casual doodles. These were sacred texts, each page a prayer, a relic, a work of divine transcription. A smudge on a manuscript wasn't an oops, it was heresy by ink. So what did monasteries do about their left-handed scribes? Well, mostly they didn't have them. Many novices were corrected, long before they reached the scriptorium. Left-handed boys were trained, aggressively, insistently, to write with their right hand. The idea of a left-handed monk copying scripture was so scandalous it's barely documented, and when it is, it's usually in the context of correction or complaint. One abbot's journal from the 13th century refers to a brother whose hand confounds the flow of ink and invites the devil's shadow into the margins. That's not a performance review, that's a theological burn. All because the guy held his pen differently. But let's say you slipped through. Let's say you were a brilliant calligrapher with a dominant left hand and a serious case of keeping it quiet. What then? You adapted. You twisted your posture unnaturally, hooked your hand over the page like a crab caught mid-blessing, and prayed that your ink dried fast. Some left-handers even tried writing backwards, literally mirror writing from right to left, just to avoid smudging. A technique famously used by Leonardo da Vinci centuries later, because even geniuses had to dodge ink splatter. But mirror writing wasn't exactly encouraged. In fact, it was seen as deeply suspicious. Unreadable to most, it was considered cryptic, possibly magical. And, as we know, magical in the Middle Ages usually translated to please burn this person at the earliest convenience. Let's not forget that art wasn't just functional, it was divine. Illuminated manuscripts weren't just texts, they were visual sermons. Gold leaf, intricate borders, tiny illustrations of sinners being devoured by snails, all executed with meticulous care. And yet, not a single known illuminator is recorded as being left-handed. Coincidence? Maybe, but more likely a result of either forced correction or erasure. Because if the art was sacred and the left hand was tainted, then letting a lefty illuminate the word of God was like letting a goat paint the Sistine Chapel. Entertaining maybe, but heretical. Outside the monasteries, the story wasn't much better. Town scribes, responsible for writing contracts, deeds, and legal documents, faced the same bias. Clients didn't want messy handwriting. Judges didn't want suspicious-looking signatures. And in a world where most people couldn't read, appearance was everything. A left-handed script, even if legible, looked off. And off was rarely welcome in a legal system that already ran on superstition and spite. Even personal letters, those few written by the elite, were judged by their neatness. A left-handed noblewoman might be able to write a beautiful poem, but if the ink bled and the lines tilted, she'd be advised to hire a secretary, or better yet, marry a man who didn't. Now you might be wondering, was left-handed art always rejected? Not always. Some forms of expression escaped the inky prison. Pottery, wood carving, even certain kinds of embroidery allowed more freedom of hand, but those were usually anonymous crafts, unsigned, uncredited. If you were a known lefty and a recognized artist, your talent was tolerated, cautiously, like a bear that could juggle. Impressive, yes, but best kept at a distance. Let's take a quiet moment. Picture a boy in a monastery, holding his quill in his left hand. He knows he shouldn't. He's been punished for it before, but the curves come easier. The letters flow smoother. His script, though forbidden, is beautiful. He stares at the ink-stained edge of his palm and knows this beauty will never be praised, only corrected. Because it doesn't matter how well he writes, it matters how he holds the pen. And that's the real tragedy, isn't it? That the medieval world, so obsessed with recording the divine, missed so many divine gestures because they came from the wrong hand. If you were left-handed in the Middle Ages, you were at best a walking inconvenience, and at worst, a walking omen. But here's a question that deserves a raised eyebrow and a raised goblet. Were there any historical figures who proudly wielded their sinister side? Any saints, sinners, rulers, rebels? Anyone who dared to live out loud and to the left? Short answer, kind of. Long answer, good luck finding them. Let's start with the saints, those glorified MVPs of the medieval religious league. You'd think that if left-handedness were just another harmless quirk, at least one saint would have been canonized with their dominant hand mentioned. But no, among thousands of hagiographies, the biographical fan fiction written about saints, handedness is rarely if ever noted. Unless, of course, it was to highlight how miraculously right-handed they were after divine intervention. Take Saint Ignatius of Antioch. According to some enthusiastic scribes, he wrote with his right hand, as guided by the Holy Spirit. Translation: if he had ever used his left, that detail was quietly edited out in favor of a more righteous narrative. In medieval storytelling, saints were moral templates, not complex humans, so any physical trait that didn't align with perfection, clubfoot, stutter, left-handedness, was either omitted or turned into a trial to overcome. Miraculously healed? Great. Still left-handed at death? Less so. You weren't likely to get a stained glass window that way. Now let's shift the spotlight to sinners, a far more colourful cast. And here finally we see handedness weaponized with abandon. Chroniclers loved to associate villains with left-handedness. It wasn't enough to be a traitor, you had to be a left-handed traitor. An archer who missed, he was left-handed. A midwife whose patient died, probably a southpaw. The assumption was clear: if something bad happened, and someone involved used their left hand, cause and effect had already been decided. There's an old legend, mostly apocryphal but fun nonetheless, about a 14th century thief named Marek the Crooked, who robbed from noble estates in Bohemia. Supposedly Marek was known for scaling walls and cutting purse strings with his left hand, earning him the nickname the Devil's Shadow. Whether Marek existed or not is beside the point. The idea of a left-handed criminal was so embedded in the medieval imagination that people simply expected it. Which makes you wonder, how many historical bad guys were remembered with an extra layer of sin, simply because of their dominant hand? Let's zoom out for a moment. Why was it so hard to find left-handed heroes? Because history, like a monastery with a checklist, preferred symmetry. Left-handedness didn't fit the template. And so it was erased, downplayed, scrubbed out of records like a smudge on holy parchment. Even if someone was left-handed, it probably didn't make the official biography. Think about it. If you were a noble knight, and you wanted your deeds remembered in verse and tapestry, would you advertise a trait everyone thought was unlucky? Or would you leave that detail out and let your victories speak for themselves? Exactly. which is why the few possible references we have are indirect, hinted at in combat style, unusual penmanship, or vague comments about peculiar movement. That's historical code for probably left-handed, but let's not dwell on it. Ironically, some of the greatest swordsmen, artists and thinkers may have been left-handed, but because history is written by the victors and illustrated by right-handed monks, the trail goes cold. Now, in the realm of rulers, the waters get murkier. There's some speculation that King James IV of Scotland may have been left-handed. His personal seal was signed in a mirrored style, which could suggest a southpaw origin, or just a flair for dramatic flair. We'll never know for sure. But the fact that historians even bother to debate it tells you how rare and intriguing such a detail would be. Because left-handedness, if confirmed in someone powerful, would have been a contradiction, a challenge to the superstition, a thorn in the tidy bouquet of divine order. Let's pause for a breath. Imagine a warrior queen who wielded a sword in her left hand and ruled without apology. Imagine a monk who refused to switch hands and illuminated entire manuscripts in mirrored glory. Imagine a saint who healed with the same hand they were once shamed for using. Now imagine those stories never written down, never celebrated, lost, because their handedness didn't match the mold. And that's the quiet tragedy at the center of this chapter. The erasure wasn't loud. It didn't come with torches or trials. It came with silence, with omissions, with stories reshaped to fit the correct hand. But maybe, just maybe, some slipped through. A left-handed knight who saved a village. A scribe whose backward writing protected secret knowledge. A farmer whose southpaw scythe struck faster. We'll never know their names. But we can imagine them, working against a world that told them they were wrong and winning anyway. So while the saints were right-handed in legend, and the sinners were left-handed by default, the truth, as always, was more complicated, more human, more hidden. If you were left-handed in medieval Europe, odds are someone, probably an old man with 3 teeth and an herbal pouch, tried to cure you, because clearly the issue wasn't that you were left-handed. It was that something deep inside you had gone wrong, and lucky for you, medieval medicine was more than happy to intervene. Let's be clear, medieval doctors operated with all the precision of a blindfolded blacksmith and the confidence of a modern internet guru. Their medical understanding relied on a colourful blend of humours, astrology, ancient Greek theories, and straight-up guesswork. Into this chaotic soup of theories, left-handedness fell quite naturally as a malady, something unnatural, unbalanced, and in desperate need of a poultice. The dominant medical theory of the time was the 4 humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Good health, they believed, came from balance among these. Bad health? Imbalance. So when a child favoured the left hand, a physician might declare that the humours on the left side of the body were overactive. The prescription: drain them. Yes, bloodletting. The correct left-handedness. Some physicians would literally bleed the patient's left arm, the theory being that it would reduce its dominance and allow the right hand to regain control. The logic was shaky, but when has that ever stopped a man with a leech? Leech therapy wasn't just for fevers. It was slapped onto any issue that defied easy explanation: depression, laziness, stubbornness, and yes, handedness. The treatment usually involved applying leeches to the offending limb, often at the wrist or upper arm. Some advanced practitioners claimed they could identify the exact vein responsible for rebellious motion. This was nonsense, of course, but confident nonsense goes a long way when you're the only one in town with a scalpel. And if leeches didn't work, there were herbs. Lots and lots of herbs. One particularly bizarre remedy involved a tea made of wormwood, juniper, and powdered cuttlefish bone. The concoction was meant to realign instinct. Side effects included nausea, diarrhea, and the lingering regret of ever trusting your apothecary. It didn't correct handedness, but it did make you forget which way was up, so success. Then came the oils. Special anointing oils were rubbed on the left hand, sometimes accompanied by prayer, in an attempt to soften the hand's rebellious tendencies. In practice, this mostly just made everything greasy and more difficult to hold, which, ironically, made the left hand less useful. Mission accomplished. But things got truly unhinged when surgical correction entered the chat. While rare, there are scattered accounts of extreme treatment, involving splints, bindings, and in one horrifying case, the dislocation of a left thumb. The goal? render the hand unusable long enough for the patient to learn to favor the right. The process was painful, ineffective, and hauntingly similar to the kinds of physical abuse later inflicted on left-handed children in the 19th and 20th centuries, because some traditions, tragically, refused to die quietly. And let's not forget the spiritual side of medicine. Left-handedness wasn't just seen as a physical problem, it was a moral one. So naturally, treatments often included confessions, prayers, and, yes, exorcisms. Priests might be called in to drive out the spirit of inversion, or to bless the hand with holy water. One 14th century case from northern Italy describes a boy forced to sleep with a wooden crucifix strapped to his left wrist. Every time he turned over in his sleep, the sharp edges would dig in. By morning, he'd roll over sore and sanctified, or traumatized. Either way, he stopped using his left hand. Let that sink in. Not because he changed, but because he was conditioned, punished into conformity, because the adults around him believed the hand he favored was evidence of corruption, not nature. And yet, despite all this, none of these methods worked in any lasting way. They couldn't. Left-handedness isn't a disease, it doesn't heal, but that didn't stop the medieval medical machine from trying, and billing, of course. Always billing, even if the cure was a goat bladder poultice and a prayer. Occasionally a more enlightened healer might suggest acceptance. These rare individuals, often tucked away in more remote or culturally diverse regions, recognized that left-handedness simply existed. But even they tread carefully. Endorsing such heresy could get you expelled from your guild, or worse, labeled a sympathizer, and no one wanted to be the left-handed doctor. That was practically a death sentence for business. So most just went along with the prevailing theories. They treated what wasn't broken, they hurt people in the name of harmony, and they called it healing. Let's take a breath here. Imagine being a child, dragged to a healer because your hand moves the wrong way. You're told you're sick. You're given foul herbs, painful bindings, and whispered prayers. Your body, your instincts are labeled defective, and every adult in your life agrees. Now imagine surviving that. Growing up, learning to smile politely as people thank your parents for fixing you, all while your dominant hand aches in silence. This was the hidden wound of left-handedness. Not the pain of correction, but the message beneath it. The idea that something in you was fundamentally off, that you needed to be rewritten, re-angled, repaired. And all because you reached for the quill with the wrong hand. Let's press pause, not on the video, but on the panic. By now we've seen left-handed people accused of heresy, shamed in classrooms, banned from battle formations, tortured by medical quackery, and publicly humiliated for stirring soup with the wrong wrist. It's been a long road of superstition, paranoia, and deeply questionable theology. So, take a deep breath, in through the nose, out through the unclean hand. Because, as absurd as all of that sounds, the story doesn't end in the Middle Ages. Nope, it keeps going, into the Enlightenment, the Industrial Revolution, and even into that supposedly rational century we all love to romanticize, the 20th, the era of light bulbs, steam engines, and unfortunately, ambidextrous scissors that were still designed to betray you. Let's time travel forward a few hundred years. The corsets are tighter, the science is flashier, and humanity has discovered germ theory. Progress. But don't get too comfortable, because if you were left-handed in, say, 1905, your life still wasn't great. Sure, they might not accuse you of making deals with Satan anymore, but they'd still make you switch hands to sign your name. Teachers still tied your left hand behind your back. Rulers were still used, only now they came with factory polish. The idea that left-handedness was a defect persisted well into modern education systems. Entire generations of children were forced to write with their right hands because the left was considered awkward, uncivilized, or sloppy. And this wasn't fringe. It was printed in official pedagogy guides, written by people who probably wore monocles and sipped tea while calmly destroying childhoods. And the tools? Oh, the tool. Let's talk scissors. Left-handed scissors were a myth, like unicorns or understanding algebra on the first try. Regular scissors simply didn't work for lefties. They pinched, they tore, they flipped paper into awkward origami, and then teachers would frown at your jagged art project and tell you to try harder, as if brute force would make metallurgy suddenly favor you. Can openers, musical instruments, notebooks with spirals on the left side, desks designed with the writing armrest on the right. Every object, quietly, insidiously, reminded left-handers that the world was not built for them. It was built for the majority, the convenient. Even language refused to evolve. Left-handed complement. 2 left feet, out in left field. You get the idea. Linguistic shade, thrown casually for centuries. So where does all this leave us? Well, ironically, left-handed people have always had to be a little more right-brained. They've had to adapt, improvise, and find new paths around a world that was hostile in the name of order. And somehow, they didn't vanish. They thrived. Quietly, persistently, ink-smudged, but unbowed. Let's look at some modern names. Leonardo da Vinci? Left-handed. So was Marie Curie, Einstein, Beethoven, Oprah, Jimi Hendrix. 4 of the last 9 US presidents were lefties. In politics, art, science, music, the sinister side made its mark. Yet even in the 1950s, studies were still being published about how to correct left-handedness in children. Some psychologists linked it to mental illness, others to delinquency. And yes, even Satan still made the occasional guest appearance in deeply religious communities. So if you're left-handed and watching this today, give yourself some credit. The fact that you exist unapologetically is a small act of historical defiance. Let's go deeper. The 20th century gave us industrialization, globalization, and school desks that were even less forgiving. As schools standardized, so did expectations. Standardized testing, standardized desks, standardized handwriting, and left-handers, well, they were standardized right out of comfort. In some countries like Japan, for instance, being left-handed remained so socially unacceptable that parents continued to train it out of children into the 1980s. In China, writing left-handed was discouraged well into the 21st because calligraphy, a sacred art, was too important to be left to the left. And in the West? Sure, the torch-wielding mobs had retired, but microaggressions took their place. Subtle comments, awkward jokes, the quiet assumption that left-handedness was something to overcome rather than embrace. So where does that leave us now? Well, awareness has improved. There are left-handed stores, ergonomic tools, ambidextrous keyboards. Left-handed guitarists can buy instruments without having to sell a kidney. Progress, right? But there's still a quiet bias. Subtle, embedded. That kid who gets marked down for messy handwriting might be a lefty using a pen designed to betray him. That job applicant who takes a second longer to sign a form at an awkward desk, maybe she's just contorting around furniture that isn't made for her. That frustrated musician whose fingers cramp faster, try holding a flute made for your opposite twin. Modern discrimination isn't always loud. Sometimes it whispers. And yet, in spite of it all, left-handers persist. They keep doing what they've always done, adapting, enduring, creating, winning, not because the world finally decided to welcome them, but because they stopped asking for permission. Let's take a slow breath. History has judged left-handedness with a strange mix of fear, disgust, and misunderstanding. From demonic branding to surgical correction, from ink-stained shame to ergonomic convenience. It's been a long, strange trip, but the left-handed never disappeared. They endured. They changed the world anyway. Still watching? Then you already know what to do. Use that cursed, brilliant, upside-down, inconvenient, beautiful hand, and click subscribe, because we've got more untold history where this came from. And trust me, it gets weirder. There was a time when being left-handed could get you exorcised, exiled, or exsanguinated. But somewhere between plague masks and polyester suits, things shifted. The sinister hand, once feared and flogged, got a makeover. Welcome to the 20th century, the era when left-handedness went from cursed to... Let's be honest, the rebranding didn't happen overnight. It took centuries of smudged ink, awkward handshakes, and failed attempts to use tin openers before left-handers finally clawed their way out of the dark ages, metaphorically and often literally. And what triggered this long-overdue PR glow-up? Disability. As more left-handed people slipped through the cracks of correctional classrooms and restrictive social codes, they started showing up in public life, not just surviving, but excelling. Left-handed painters, athletes, musicians, and world leaders began to disrupt the tidy narrative that being left-handed meant being deficient, defective, or divinely damned. Let's talk politics. And then there was the pop culture boost. Jimi Hendrix, guitar god, string sorcerer, famously played left-handed. But here's the kicker. Most guitars weren't designed for him. So he flipped them upside down, literally restrung his instrument to match his hand. That kind of visual spectacle was unforgettable. Left-handedness suddenly became not just different, but iconic. The same happened in sports. Baseball players like Babe Ruth and Ted Williams showed that being a lefty wasn't just acceptable, it was an edge. Southpaws pitched differently, swung differently, played angles others couldn't predict. Coaches began to crave them. Whole training regimes adjusted around them. Left-handedness wasn't a curse anymore. It was a weapon. But it wasn't just talent. It was branding. In the 1960s and 70s, an era of civil rights movements, counterculture rebellion and general distrust of the system being different started to look appealing. And what better subtle rebellion than the hand you used to write a love letter, light a cigarette, or flip the bird at authority? Left-handedness became a personality trait. Something to list in interviews. A mark of creativity, intelligence, and non-conformity. Psychologists jumped in with theories, most of them half-baked, about how left-handed people were more intuitive, imaginative, emotionally driven. Left-handedness became shorthand for genius. Was it true? Sort of. Studies showed a mild correlation between left-handedness and divergent thinking. But correlation isn't causation, and many of those studies were, let's just say, generously interpreted by the media. Still, the myth stuck, and when a myth makes you look cool, no one rushes to debunk it. Suddenly, products appeared. Left-handed scissors, left-handed notebooks, left-handed watches, even mugs with the image facing the proper way when held in your left hand. Because apparently branding now had a direction, a small but enthusiastic market bloomed. Being left-handed had gone commercial. But before we get too celebratory, let's examine the fine print. This rebranding mostly helped left-handers who were already visible. Famous people, wealthy people, people who could afford to be quirky in a socially acceptable way. For regular folks, the world still wasn't quite caught up. School desks were still right-handed. So were measuring cups. So were camera grips, power tools, kitchen ladles, and video game controllers. Yes, there were improvements, but they were slow, partial, often overpriced. And in many parts of the world, especially in conservative or heavily traditional societies, left-handedness remained taboo well into the modern day. In some Middle Eastern and South Asian cultures, eating with the left hand is still discouraged, seen as unclean, disrespectful, or impolite. In certain African countries, left-handed handshakes are considered rude. Children are still corrected, still shamed, still nudged, gently or not, toward the correct hand. So while Western pop culture was handing out gold stars to southpaws, millions of people were still hiding theirs behind their backs. Let's pause. Imagine being a left-handed child in 1990s rural India. You go to school, pick up your pencil, the teacher winces, you're told, kindly but firmly, to switch hands. Not because of Satan, not because of demons, but because it's not proper, because it's not how it's done. Now imagine seeing Michael Jackson, a fellow lefty, moonwalk across your television screen. You watch him sign autographs with flair. You wonder, just for a moment, if maybe your hand isn't wrong after all. That's what rebranding does. Not just for culture, but for confidence. Because when the world starts celebrating what it used to condemn, a space opens up. A space where you can say, this is me, and not expect punishment. But let's be clear, the rebranding wasn't always pure. In some cases, it was a marketing gimmick. Companies realized left-handed consumers had been ignored, so they cashed in. Suddenly, a potato peeler designed for a lefty cost twice as much, a premium, for your own anatomy. So yes, left-handedness became cool, but it also became commodified. Still, there's something poetic in the reversal. The same hand once burned, bound, and bled now played pianos, led nations, and autographed books. The wrong hand became the signature of brilliance, and that perhaps is the real victory. Not that the world fully changed, but that left-handed people stopped waiting for permission. Let's dim the lights a bit, because beneath the spectacle, the celebrity southpaws, the novelty scissors, the quirky fun fact, I'm left-handed, coffee mugs, there's a quieter story, one that doesn't get its own merchandise, one that doesn't end in applause. This is the part of the history that doesn't shout. It whispers. It trembles. It hides under long sleeves and polite silence. Because for every left-handed president or guitar hero, there are thousands who were quietly erased, bent into new shapes by systems that didn't ask them who they were, just told them who they had to be. Let's start in the classroom. Even in the 1980s, yes, the era of neon leg warmers and synth pop, left-handed children were still being corrected in schools across the world. In rural parts of the United States, teachers would gently tap a left hand with a ruler, not out of malice, but habit. "It's just better this way," they'd say. "You'll thank me later." In Ireland, Catholic schools continued the tradition of enforced right-handed writing well into the late 20th century. In the UK, children were placed in awkward desk positions that forced them to contort their bodies just to pass spelling tests. The ink smudged. The teachers sighed. The children internalized it. "I must be doing it wrong." And here's the thing. It worked. Left-handed kids learned to write with their right hands. Some became ambidextrous, others dyslexic. Some developed hand tremors, stutters, anxiety. Because when you're told from the earliest age that your instinct is incorrect, you start to question every instinct that follows. Let that sink in. This wasn't just about hands. It was about identity, autonomy, trust. When a child is taught that the way their body moves is inherently wrong, they don't just unlearn a habit, they learn shame. We don't talk enough about that. The emotional toll of correctional teaching left scars that couldn't be seen on X-rays. A generation of left-handed adults still flinch when someone comments on their pen grip, still carry the quiet guilt of sloppy handwriting, as if it says something about their intelligence or worth, still hesitate before reaching for a handshake or high five, unconsciously questioning, "Am I doing this wrong again?" Meet Marta. She grew up in Poland in the 1970s. Left-handed, curious, brilliant with patterns. But every time she picked up a pencil, her teacher frowned. No, no, no. They tied her left arm to the chair for writing lessons. Her mother was told to reinforce the lesson at home. By the time Marta turned 10, she'd stopped drawing altogether. She didn't want to hold anything anymore. She became an accountant. She tells her story with a soft laugh. "Numbers don't care what hand you use," she says. But her eyes? They say something else. Then there's Ezra. Born in Nigeria, moved to London at age 6. He remembers the first week of school, getting slapped on the knuckles every time he reached for a crayon with his left hand. His father told him it was a bad habit. It wasn't until university that Ezra started sketching again, with his left hand. Quietly, alone, as if he were confessing something. These aren't isolated stories. In many countries, left-handedness is still associated with weakness, rebellion, or defiance. In some cases, it's a gendered issue. Girls are corrected more often, expected to be neater, quieter, less troublesome. The pressure to conform isn't just physical, it's social, cultural, familial. So while the world claps for left-handed celebrities, it often ignores the silent suffering of everyday people forced to rewrite themselves. Even today, the ghosts linger. Modern left-handers still navigate spaces not designed for them. In hospitals, most surgical tools are right-handed. In auto shops, most mechanics must adapt tools to their grip. Left-handed pilots must train in cockpits with right-dominant configurations. These aren't just inconveniences, they're risks. Then there's the emotional labor. The constant double-take when reaching for a handshake. The quiet correction when passing food. The inner monologue that runs every time someone notices, "Oh, you're left-handed," as if it were a party trick. Not a constant, exhausting recalibration. It's not trauma in the cinematic sense, it's slower, stickier. It embeds itself in muscle memory and self-doubt. It lingers in the gap between instinct and permission. And yet, left-handers continue. They adapt. They endure. Not with fireworks, but with quiet persistence. They become doctors, teachers, artists, parents. They pass down stories, warnings, tips, tricks. Some teach their children to be proud of their left-handedness. Others, still wounded, hesitate, because healing is not always loud, and neither is harm. So yes, history rebranded left-handedness gave it a makeover. But not everyone got the memo. And not everyone recovered in time for the re-release. Let's breathe that in. For every left-handed success story, there are dozens more, written in invisible ink, erased from the margins. People who were never allowed to become who they were supposed to be, who learned to hide their hand, their instinct, their truth. That's why this chapter matters, because even in a world of glittery self-acceptance hashtags and ergonomic product lines, we still carry the echoes of every ruler slap, every desk turned against us, every adult who told us kindly, cruelly to be something else. History doesn't just hurt with fire. Sometimes it whispers, "You're wrong." And sometimes we believe it, but not forever. Take a long look in the mirror. No, seriously, pause for a second. Look at your face, your hair, the hand you naturally use to brush your teeth. Now ask yourself, how many of those things would have gotten you labeled suspicious, sinful, or straight up evil in the Middle Ages? Because here's the uncomfortable truth. Left-handedness wasn't an isolated superstition. It was just one pixel in a much larger, uglier painting, one framed in fear, inked in ignorance, hung proudly on the walls of every institution that ever feared difference. So let's zoom out. The human brain is a categorizing machine. It likes patterns, labels, symmetry. If something doesn't fit the box, left-handedness for example, the brain freaks out a little. And when enough people freak out together, you get society. And when society freaks out long enough, you get prejudice. Left-handed people were demonized, not because they posed any threat, but because they broke the mold. And humans love molds. They make things feel safe, predictable, controllable. Even if that mold is totally made up, the same mindset applied to dozens of other traits throughout history. Let's start with red hair. Yes, gingerism, a real and enduring flavor of medieval paranoia. In some European societies, redheads were thought to be witches, vampires, or the spawn of demons. Judas was often depicted with red hair in religious art, because of course betrayal and pigmentation must go hand in hand. Next up, eye color. In certain medieval towns, people with heterochromia, two different colored eyes, were branded as shapeshifters, or cursed beings, one eye for the devil, the other for deceit. Logical? Not at all. Popular? You bet. And then there's skin tone. Entire continents justified slavery, colonization, and systemic violence based on melanin levels, a biological variation interpreted conveniently as moral inferiority. Sound familiar? It's the same script, recycled with a new target. Different trait, same superstition. Now think about stuttering, limping, twitching. Medieval thinkers, bless their consistently incorrect hearts, often believed physical tics were signs of inner corruption. A limp might mean spiritual imbalance. A stutter? Demonic possession. Tourette? Oh, you better call the priest and the town mob, because clearly that person was hosting a demon karaoke night inside their skull. It all comes back to one idea. If something looks, sounds, or feels off, it must be dangerous. Difference becomes deviance, and deviance becomes damnation. Left-handedness was just the handiest scapegoat. It was visible, inescapable, a literal sign of non-conformity. So society, ever hungry for scapegoats, latched onto it with all the nuance of a pitchfork. Here's where it gets darker. The demonization of physical difference laid the groundwork for some of history's most grotesque ideologies. The science of phrenology, where skull shape allegedly determined intelligence or criminality, emerged in the 18th and 19th centuries, but its roots squarely medieval. If your head was too round, your brow too sloped, your jaw too wide, congratulations, you were now a data point in someone's pseudo-scientific excuse for prejudice. And let's not forget gender. Women with opinions were labeled hysterical. Women with knowledge were witches. Women who didn't marry were unnatural. And left-handed women? Oh boy. That's a triple threat right there. Good luck surviving the 1300s with that combo. The same logic followed LGBTQ+ individuals, neurodivergent people, anyone with epilepsy, depression, or, heaven forbid, curiosity. Because the further you strayed from the arbitrary norm, the closer you came to exile, execution, or erasure. Let that sink in. Being different wasn't a quirk, it was a liability, an existential risk, and all of it, every suspicious glance, Every whisper in the pews, every accusation that ended in flames, stemmed from the same terrified impulse. If I don't understand it, it must be evil. Now let's fast forward. Today we celebrate diversity, at least in theory, but the ghosts linger. Bias still exists. It's just subtler, smoother. It wears better clothes. Left-handedness isn't a death sentence anymore. But in some countries it's still corrected. In some schools, it's still discouraged. Some grandparents still slap wrists. Some employers still design tools, workflows and systems assuming right is the only direction worth planning for. And those same assumptions show up everywhere. In hiring practices, healthcare, education, policing, fashion, language. Think about the phrase straight and narrow versus going off the rails, or how black sheep is bad but white knight is good. Language reveals bias like fog reveals street lamps. So what do we do with this? We look in the mirror again. We ask, what parts of me have been quietly condemned? What instincts have I dulled to fit in? What quirks have I silenced because I feared they'd be misread? And just as importantly, whose differences have I judged without realizing? Because prejudice isn't always fire and brimstone. Sometimes it's polite suggestions, standardized forms, one-size-fits-all solutions. It's designing a world for one type of person and quietly punishing anyone who doesn't fit. That's why this chapter isn't just about left-handedness. It's about mirrors. It's about recognizing that what we label strange is often just unfamiliar, that what we call deviant might be perfectly normal, just not normalized, and that every time history looked at someone who moved, thought, or loved differently and said, "You don't belong," it wasn't revealing a truth. It was revealing a fear. So maybe the real question isn't, why did they fear left-handed people? Maybe it's this. What fears are we still holding on to? And who are we still holding back because of them? Let's play a game. It's called Would You Have Survived the Middle Ages? Spoiler alert, probably not. But hey, that's part of the fun. A gentle little stroll through your own hypothetical execution. Here's how it works. I'll describe a few behaviors, traits, or quirks. You check off the ones that apply to you. The more boxes you tick, the more likely you'd have been carted off by a torch-wielding mob, accusing you of heresy, witchcraft, or, God forbid, thinking too much. Ready? You sleep on your left side. Ding! Suspicious. You write with your left hand. Burn them. You talk to yourself sometimes. Witchcraft. Clear. You have a tattoo. Might as well hand yourself over. You're left-handed and lactose intolerant. That's not a person. That's a medieval demon in disguise. See how fast it spirals. Because the threshold for normal back then was, well, terrifyingly narrow. If you fell outside the bell curve by even a whisper in behavior, in appearance, in belief, you weren't just odd, you were dangerous. Let's imagine, it's 3047. You're walking through your village, minding your own business, probably trying to avoid dying of plague or starvation or spontaneous moral panic. You pick up an apple with your left hand. A neighbor sees, her eyes narrow. Later that day, you're summoned. Why did you reach with your sinister hand? They ask. Not in jest. With genuine fear, you stammer. You say it's just natural. They shake their heads. The devil loves what is natural. That's how he deceives. Boom. Now you're on trial. Now let's say you're someone who enjoys silence. You don't gossip. You don't chatter at the market. You keep to yourself. That makes you, drumroll, suspiciously secretive. Add to that, you don't attend church every week. Or maybe you ask too many questions during sermons. Or maybe you read too much. Or not enough. Or you have a limp. Or you look someone directly in the eye. Or avoid it. Or your bread didn't rise that one time. It didn't take much. The medieval world was not built to accommodate individuality. It wasn't exactly vibing with the idea of you do you. In fact, you do you was a punishable offense, often followed by a long stay in a damp dungeon or a short stay on a very flammable stake. Let's add a few more what-ifs. You're an artist, but your style is unconventional. That's not creativity. That's a pact with infernal muses. You hum strange tunes. You pick herbs. You walk alone at night. You're unmarried past 30. Oh no, a definite witch. Now switch eras. Jump to the Victorian period. Still think you'd be safe? Maybe you dress a bit eccentrically. Maybe you're emotional. Maybe you prefer cats to people. That's not personality. That's pathology. Off to the asylum you go. Diagnosis: mildly inconvenient woman. Or let's say you're a man who likes embroidery, or skincare, or literature that makes you cry. Now you're unnatural, you're Now, take a beat. How much of your modern self would have fit into any of these time periods? Your mental health, your religion, or lack thereof, your sexuality, your taste in music, the way you speak, the way you dance, the fact that you dance at all, you starting to sweat? Good, that's the point. Because it reminds us that what we take for granted as normal is always a moving target, defined by those in power, enforced by fear, and twisted by people who genuinely believed they were doing the right thing by erasing anything that made them uncomfortable. It's easy to laugh at the old beliefs. Haha, they thought left-handedness was the devil's work. But zoom in, and the story stops being funny. Because behind every accusation was a real person. A child scared and confused, trying to remember which hand they were allowed to use. A midwife, proud of her skills, suddenly told she was a witch for helping too many mothers survive childbirth. A boy who loved singing, taken from his family because his voice tempted the devil. A scholar burned for thinking the earth might go around the sun. So yeah, fun little game, huh? Here's another one. What would your neighbors whisper about you? If society collapsed tomorrow and we rebooted our belief systems from scratch, would your social awkwardness be charming or cursed? Would your unusual fashion sense be trend-setting or evidence of sorcery? Would your TikTok algorithm history get you canonized or incinerate? That's the mirror this chapter holds up. Because history isn't just old, it's reflective. It shows us where we've come from, yes, but it also dares us to ask what patterns we're still repeating, what judgments we're still making, what differences we still label wrong. So here's the final question. If you were transported back 700 years, would you survive? Or would you, like so many others, end up branded, bound, and blamed for simply being yourself? And if the answer is the latter, ask yourself this. Why are we still building worlds where that could happen? Why do so many people still have to hide who they are just to be safe? Maybe the real heresy is forgetting that. So, let's come back to where this all began. A hand. Not a metaphor, not a symbol. Just a hand. 5 fingers, a palm, a collection of bones, muscles, and evolutionary luck that for some people happens to be more dominant on the left side. And for centuries, that simple anatomical fact could decide the course of your life or the abrupt end of it. Let that sink in. A single body part, not diseased, not dangerous, not contagious, just different. And difference, as we've seen, was a threat. A red flag, a reason to shun, to shame, to strike. But hands, they're kind of everything, aren't they? We use them to write, to feed ourselves, to build, to break, to hold a loved one, to strike a match, to raise a sword, or a flag, or a question. Hands shape the world, literally and figuratively. So, imagine what it meant, psychologically and spiritually, to be told that your hand, the one you use without thinking, the one that makes you you, was wrong. Imagine being a child and feeling a ruler slam across your knuckles for choosing the bad hand. Not because you were disobedient, not because you lied or cheated, but because your brain was wired differently. A twist of nature turned into a moral failing. That's not correction, that's trauma. Now multiply that across centuries. Generations of people taught to mistrust their own instincts, to suppress their reflexes, to hide their physical truth. All because society in its infinite wisdom decided there was only one right way to exist. And it wasn't yours. But here's the twist. Left-handed people persisted. They learned to write against the grain. Sometimes literally. They adapted to tools made for someone else's comfort. They became musicians, scientists, artists, and leaders. They flipped the narrative, and slowly, painfully, the world began to notice. Not always kindly, not always fairly, but progress isn't a single step. It's a grindstone. There's something poetic about it, really. The same hand that was once burned at the stake is now celebrated on stage. The hand that was tied behind backs is now holding Nobel Prizes, Grammy Awards, peace treaties, mic stands, steering wheel. The hand you were dealt, the one society tried to fold, is now playing its own game. And that's the real story here. Not just the absurdity of historical superstition. Not just the morbidly fascinating ways people misunderstood the human body, but the quiet, relentless strength of the people who were different and dared to exist anyway. They didn't burn down the system overnight. Most didn't get the luxury of revolution, but they wrote, they worked, they parented, they taught, they resisted in small, daily ways that history rarely remembers, but which shaped the world we live in now. The world where you can click this video with your left hand and not get arrested, where you can choose your pen, your path, your posture, and nobody bats an eye. Okay, they still make weird scissors, but we're working on it. The point is, we got here. Slowly, imperfectly, but we got here. And yet, there are still people being told that their version of normal is incorrect, that their instincts are flawed, that their identity must be corrected, or shamed, or hidden. The target moves, but the tactic stays the same. So maybe it's not just about handedness. Maybe it's about the cost of compliance. About how many people we've lost, not physically but creatively, emotionally, spiritually, because they were forced to live as someone else. About how many minds we silenced, how many voices we redirected, how many hands we broke to make them fit a mold. The question is, what are we doing with our hands now? Are we using them to build better systems, to reach across divides, to pull others up, or are we still quietly slapping wrists, just in subtler ways? Because here's the truth that no medieval priest, schoolmaster, or cobbler guild could stamp out. There is no correct way to be human. There's just your way. And yes, it might be clumsy, or loud, or unexpected, or left-handed, but it's yours. And that's all it ever needed to be. So the next time someone tells you you're doing it wrong, that your way of writing, living, loving, or existing is misaligned, remember this entire absurd saga. Remember the torch-bearing mobs who feared fingers, the scholars who prescribed bloodletting for handedness, the teachers who tried to rewrite neurology with shame and laugh, but then do something serious with that laughter. Use your hand, whatever hand it may be, to keep the cycle from repeating. Because history might rhyme, but it doesn't have to repeat. And the world is far too weird, too wonderful, and too full of ambidextrous scissors to go backward now. You were never the problem. They were just afraid of the hand you were dealt. Now, play your cards. History judged people for things as ridiculous as the hand they used to write their name. So if you made it this far using yours, maybe give that thumb a workout. Like, subscribe, and share this with someone delightfully different. Because in this timeline, we embrace the left hand, even at bedtime.